The rapprochement is striking between the concept of deification in the Christian Eastern tradition and that of realization in the supreme identity of the Atman and of the Brahman according to the Advaita Vedanta. We cannot study it here. We shall simply point out that deification by the uncreated energies makes man a full participant in the divine life beyond all duality. This Advaitic experience rests upon a relationship personal from the outset through integration with Christ. In the same way, the Brahman, with attributes, is the visage of the Absolute and allows us to know the Absolute, because he is also the Brahman beyond any attributes. He who is Shakti is also Brahman. Let us recapitulate. Christian theology, especially in the East, thus in some way distinguishes four levels, or four moments in reflection and in enunciation. Firstly, the level of the deity, of the absolute divine essence, isolated in his aseity. This is totally unknowable. One can affirm nothing unless it be unity. Thus one can only speak in terms of apophatic theology. The second level is that of the deity inasmuch as it enters into an internal rapport. This is the eternal procession of the divine persons of the Trinity. The persons flow ceaselessly from the divine essence and eternally flow back into it. This procession of the Trinity ad intra also remains fundamentally unknowable. The only references that we have are only an extrapolation from what we have been able to know of God in his economy, in the Greek sense economia, meaning in creation and in salvation history, in which he reveals himself. The third level is precisely that of the external relation of the Trinity with the creation, and particularly the cosmic event of the Christic incarnation. It is here, at this properly historical and hermeneutical level, that theology will be the least apophatic and the least negative. It is here that it will extend itself as a discipline to sound the mystery of God with language, all the while remaining incapable of making present what it seeks to represent. Thus it will limit itself to pointing out a direction, to indicating, to showing. Finally, the fourth level is that in which theologia and theoria, contemplation in Greek, merge. Here theology is no longer a rational deduction from premises revealed through the scriptures or through defined dogmas, but a vision. Not a vision of the divine essence, but indeed of the deifying Taboric light, which is communication of God himself and participation in Trinitarian life. This new knowledge, the most elevated possible, is founded on the distinction between the divine essence and the uncreated but participatable energies. Illuminated, transfigured, or realized man transcends everything created and reaches a sort of indistinction with God, otherwise called deification, and surpasses any duality without falling into a pantheistic type of identification, as some have suggested. Here theology will always be discursive, while experiential. It is no longer so much a language on, even though it retains all the appearances, but a language from, a language flowing from within, whose expressions are surpassed by the excess or plenitude of a presence. This language freely and spontaneously flows from and expresses itself on the basis of the ineffable experience of the mystical union. Literature, having this mystical union as its theme, is no doubt abundant, but paradoxically deals with what one can neither say nor know. In the last analysis, the deification experience ends up expressing itself in the unsaid of language. Henceforth, theology will be less a search for positive knowledge about the divine being than an experience of what is beyond all understanding. These four movements or levels which we have distinguished in theology ought, in fact, to be reducible to only two, that of God ad intra, for one cannot dissociate the divine essence from its hypostasis, and that of God ad extra, knowable in his energies. Transcendence, language, and postmodernity. Is apophatis and personal participation in the divine contradictory? They are in fact the two irreducible poles of one and the same experience, which, such as it is formulated in the Eastern Christian tradition, but also in part in Western apophatism, apophaticism, paradoxically corresponds to the status and responds to the demands of a postmodern theology. Here, spiritual truth will henceforth bear the mark of the relation between the effacement of a particular significant event and what they make possible, that is, a dissemination of meaning in the field of interpretations. But in short, these marks or words are bearers of a primary, original meaning, allowing theology to effect a legibility in the real. A legibility in the real. But the significance of this theological discourse remains within language. Going further, deconstructionist thought tears metaphysical status away from the sign, for there is nothing signified which is not already in the position of a signifier. As a consequence, scripture or discourse consists in a play of differences, of continual referrals, deconstructing the metaphysical notion of God or that of the subject's presence to self, thus depriving the question of the origin of meaning of all pertinence. Meaning is drawn into a process of dissemination, indefinite this time, bearing the very possibility of the hermeneutical enterprise, which postulates a meaning and a signifier signified rapport, and a signifier signified rapport. Every sign being always already inscribed within an interpretive network, there is no first truth to interpret. This is the indefinite referral of signifier to signifier. Certitude is inaccessible given the perpetual instability of the sign. Meaning is formed and deformed in a continuous interweaving in such a way that an interpretation never unveils a definitive meaning, but enlarges the text or speech in producing new meanings. Language possesses no definitive meaning, but always remains transitional and erratic. Thus, consciousness apprehends only signs disposed in a differential network. Transcendental signified disappears and makes the divine milieu possible, conceived as non-totalizable totality, where the finite is an interior dimension of infinitude, and reciprocally, the death of God in the secular city can henceforth be understood in terms of a radical Christology, whose logos is always necessarily spermatikos, meaning in a perpetual motion of dissemination. Modernity called the discursive and practical structures upon which traditional society rested into question. Deconstructive analysis calls into question the totality of the network of notions and concepts which founded philosophical and theological thought, such as the priority of the subject over predicates, as well as its alleged independence. But the subject is itself always already linked to a linguistic network and becomes a function of a given tongue. This radical dispossession of the subject opens endless possibilities of overtures. Doesn't it seem to rejoin the theologico-mystical experience of the Christian East, which also concludes to the radical incompletion of the tradition as an attempt at closure and mastery of meaning? Shaktipata, grace in Kashmir Shaivism. Jankanath Kal Kamal. That indescribable supreme state which is revealed in a spontaneous moment of grace, regardless of time or place, to an earnest devotee, while he has been absorbed continuously in spiritual practice for an unknown period, and for a supreme joy, ananda, that wipes off all doubt and fear whatsoever. That is verily the true accomplishment for celestials, for manis, and for human beings. By whose grace this happens, to that great preceptor of supreme splendor, who is my own self, this prostration is made. Rediscovery of the Shaiva faith was made around the 9th century AD in Kashmir, conspicuously by Vasugupta, to whom the Shiva Sutras were revealed by Lord Shiva himself. Vasugupta's Spandakarika, a purport of the Shiva Sutras, was elaborated by his well-conducted disciple Kalata by name. Kalata Bhatta is therefore known as the first acharya of the Spanda order of Kashmir Shaivism, which is also called Trika Shastra or Shasana because it evidently discusses the three modes of reality via Nara, Shiva, and the connecting link Shakti, Nara Shakti Shivatmakam, Trikam, Abhinavagupta, Paratrishika Vivarana. precisely known as Apara, Para, and Parapara, an evidence of the monistic character of the Tantras. Later, Somanandanatha's Shiva Distri and Utpaladeva's Ishvara Pratyabhijna respectively introduced and elucidated the Pratyabhijna thought by which name Kashmir Shaiva mysticism is known today. Before this development, according to Swami Laxman Jo, the last exponent of Kashmir Shaivism, the Kula system, advocating the highest form of Shiva, had been introduced in Kashmir sometime in the 4th century AD, and the Krama system, connected with Raja Yoga and Kundalini Yoga, which stressed the independence of vital airs and mind, had existed there even earlier, as is witnessed through Yoga Vashishta. The Vedantic thought of Gaudapada and Shankaracharya through their Mandukya Karikas and Prasthanatrayi, respectively, had also influenced Kashmir simultaneously. The result was that Kashmir Shaiva mysticism, i.e., Trika philosophy, developed with ideas relevant to the order from almost all schools of Indian philosophy. Kashmir Shaivism, in its entirety, was further elaborated in a systematic form by the great master Abhinavagupta Pada in his Tantra Loka. Among his other important works, Paratrishika Vivarana, that explains the secret of Tantric mysticism, is the most outstanding one. Thus, Abhinavagupta gave clear dimensions to Shaivism that had developed with its different forms in Kashmir. Consequently, there are different means suggested for attainment of supreme beatitude that every human being, celestials and manis, aspire for directly or indirectly, but the most direct and easy way is to have the grace of a guru and the impact of his power, called Shaktipada, even while the means are followed by aspirants in accordance with their individual capacities, levels of intellect, or intensity in devotion. There arises need of one important thing for all, and that is compassion, kirpa, or favor, anugraha, which the Tantric Acharyas called Shaktipada. To my mind, it appears necessary to understand Shaktipada in 3 ways, namely, 1. What it is, 2. When it happens, and 3. How it works. What Shaktipada is. Shaktipada is difficult to define, but it is certainly more than just the absence of desire. It reflects a state of consciousness, serene and taintless, and virtually constitutes the sovereign will of Lord Shiva. In English language we strictly call it grace, and not favor, because the latter is measurable against its opposite term, disfavor. Grace is immeasurable. It is an elegance of manner, a graciousness, which can only be a gift from God. It is not given because we desire it. God gives this gift out of intense love for the devotee, whom he chooses to be blessed. Grace does not descend even upon an aspirant who is actually alert for it, or even in samadhi. Sage Ashtavakra said to Janaka, Ayameva hi te bandha samadhim avastithasi. This is what binds you because you always sit in samadhi. Grace may descend in passive alertness, which is actually choiceless awareness of divinity. Shaktipada, therefore, may depend on the power of complete surrender to the Absolute. Ishvara Pranidhanadva, according to the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, the aspirant says to himself, what have I to do with wishing? His will be done. To him surrendered, I have no wish of my own. Parvati seems to have made such an utterance to herself when Shiva, in the guise of a brahmachari, came to see the depth of her faith that had led her to severe penance. No sooner did the brahmachari want to deviate her mind from Lord Shiva than she wanted to turn away from his presence. But how far? She could neither go ahead nor keep back. This situation is beautifully expressed in Kalidasa. Saila Dirajatanaya Yayanatastau. It was that divine ecstasy, that abrupt bloom of supreme consciousness where there is no coming in or going out. Parvati experienced perfect bliss on recognizing the presence of Shiva himself. Shaktipada, according to monistic mysticism, is unconditional and unhindered. Natrakopi Atmiya Purushakara Vidyate, there is no human effort for earning Shaktipada. Galipadikaya Natha Niyate Sadgurum Prati. One is directed to the great preceptor as if tethered with a rope. The Upanishad also declares, the Atman can be realized only by him whom he favors, and to him he reveals himself. Dattatreya's Avaduta Gita begins with the declaration, Ishvara Nugraha Deva, Pumsham Advaita Vashana. It is through the Lord's grace alone that one is led to monistic practices for self-realization. It is therefore by the independent will of Lord Shiva that Shaktipata, or divine grace, may be granted to anyone, at any place, and even at any time. It is a transmission through Guru Shakti, through which the Shakti, in the person of the disciple, is awakened and activated. And that is natural, says M.P. Pandit, clarifying further, for this discipline revolves upon an axis of two ends, the Guru and the disciple. In the dynamics of this yogic sadhana, both have their parts to play. True, the major role is played by the power of the Guru, which initiates and works the yoga, but the disciple too has a responsibility. He has to contain and support the Shaktipada in its continued workings. Ceaseless purification and reorientation of one's energies of the body, life, and mind, so as to collaborate with the power set in operation by the Guru, is indispensable. Personal exertion in some form or other is necessary to equip and perfect the adara in which the Guru releases his tapas shakti. At any rate, it is indispensable till the nature and the being of the disciple are completely surrendered to the higher will that is active, and his sadhana is entirely taken charge of by the Shakti. It is evident, therefore, that surrender, prapati, and grace, Shaktipata, go together, as is concretely expressed by Keshavamurti of Sri Aurobindo Ashrama. It looks as if in the scheme of manifestation, both man and God wait for some excuse, one to receive the grace and the other to bestow it, and at the end of the long journey both man and God fuse in a grand play, Leela. Thus Shaktipada is an indefinite point of contact between Jiva and Ishvara, where the former's individual age merges completely in the supreme reality, the monistic sovereignty that the wise call eternal joy and perfect bliss. Divine grace is that light whose presence removes the darkness of ignorance with all its associated doubts. It changes a guessing game into a vivid and colorful experience of supreme awakening, where there is not an iota of duality, all self everywhere. Sharvamidam aham chabramaiva, says the Sruti. Utpaladeva prayed to Lord Shiva and pined to get firmly established in this super state, where not even a trace of otherness exists, where self-luminosity is everywhere manifest. There in your city let me reside forever as your worshipper. Shiva Stotravali 13.9. The Upanishad also tells about the favor granted to Brahma among Devas, to Shanaka among Rishis, and to Shukadeva among human beings, who remain not even for a moment without the awareness of supreme consciousness. Where there is no gap of thought, no distraction, which is the universal gleam of consciousness, ever new, ever filled with increasing flow of divine nectar, where there is no sitting for samadhi, etc. That is Jagadananda, as explained to me by Shambhanatha. Blessed with Shaktipada, the aspirant devotee witnesses no distinction between within and without, between the knower and the known. He has realized that Brahman is ever the same, residing in all things. In the words of Sri Aurobindo, the highest emergence is the liberated man, who has realized the self and spirit within him, entered into the cosmic consciousness, passed into union with the eternal, and so far as he still accepts life and action, acts by the light of energy of the power within him, working through his human instruments of nature. After this state is revealed to an aspirant through Shaktipada of the utmost intensity, Tivra, as classed by Abhinavagupta, nothing can shake his sense of reality. There is no pain above this and no joy beyond this for him, and is endorsed by the Bhagavad Gita itself. He wins a prize beyond all others, or so he thinks. Therein he firmly stands, unmoved by any suffering, however grievous it may be. Bhagavad Gita 6.22. When Shaktipada happens and the ego gets consumed in the fire of God's wisdom, the devotee gets dissolved in the ocean of his love. That Ananda of Parabrahman is knowable only in experience, when there is slow dawning of Ratambara Prajna, consciousness full of truth. Then there is the revelation of Parabrahman at the lucky moment of Shaktipada. It operates in every line of spiritual effort when the most pious relation of preceptor-disciple is recognized. Shaktipada works in different forms at different levels of spiritual progress. Abhinavaguptapada in his Tantra Loka has discussed at length the different levels of consciousness at which Shaktipada works in a systematic combination of its three basic forms, via Tivra intense, Madhya middle, and Manda slow. Shaktipada, being an integral part of the Indian spiritual tradition, is made to happen by the preceptor, who has capacity and the higher sanction to effect the pata in the disciple whom he chooses or is directed to choose. Such a guru is capable of regulating and, if necessary, checking this course of power already released into action. In the latter case also there is an injunction prescribed in the Tantra. Finding opposite or negative inclination in the disciple, the guru should draw back the infused power of knowledge from him. To quote a few examples of positive inclinations, 1. Kakabusandi lived the long life of Yogi Jivan Mukta on being established in the middle path of the two breaths, prana and apana, with perfect knowledge of self, as also evidenced in the Netra Tantra. This supreme consciousness has awakened through the grace of prana kundalini. 2. Queen Kudala is described to have worked grace on her husband, Sikidvaja, at the mental plane. She aroused his Chit Kundalini, telling him, recognize Kundalini in yourself. That is the very life of mind which is called Puryashtaka. Such a grace is imparted like the scent of a flower by means of touch. 3. Hanuman, directed by King Sugriva for spying, was chosen for Shaktipata through Bodha Kundalini when he met Sri Rama, who had been wandering in the forest in Kishkinda in search of Sita. Hanuman recognized his divine preceptor in Rama, who graced him through mere sight. Both had met in their choiceless awareness. Shaktipada thus takes place in a situation of desirelessness, or kama samnyasa, which the Bhagavad Gita calls karma samnyasa or nishkama karma yoga. This may be possible only when the individual ego is not able to work for its limited ends, and when actions are performed with detachment, but devotion and to the best of one's ability. Then the endless chain of karma also ceases. Ksiyante chasya karmani tasmin durste paravare. When the supreme reality is revealed, all karmas, agami, sanchita, and prarabdha are but to flight. God realization, the wise say, is an overall change in mental attitude of a sadhaka. It is spiritual entirety, and that divine transformation comes in a moment when the grace of Shaktipada works through. It comes instantaneously, almost unaware, but that Brahma world is ever illumined. The sadhaka, blessed with very intense tivra Shaktipada, has not to strive or search for it. It comes spontaneously to him like a surprise gift. Among the 1,000 names of Parashakti listed in the 139 Sanskrit verses in Bhavani Nama Sadasrastuti, there are names like Nimesha, Megamala, and Muhurta, extolling the deity who is one with Parashiva. The name Nimesha connotes that Parashakti bestows grace of Shaktipada in a moment, like the high tension power of electricity, which is blissfully soothing and eternally sweet. Parashakti is named Megamala as she acts like a streak of lightning in the clouds. The Divine Mother's grace may rise from anywhere or may get absorbed at any moment. Her grace accelerates the degree of awareness in an aspirant. The name Muhurta stands for the equinoctial point of grace. Shiva, according to Shaiva mysticism, is the great guru. His grace remains always unlocked. Parvati or Shakti is the power of his grace, known as Gurura Nugrahika Shakti. In the Shaiva Shakta way of thought, Shiva impels grace through his Shakti, who with her own free will affects Shaktipata on a sincere and earnest devotee, the when, where, and how of which cannot be known. It is an internal process concealed in the rarely catchable moment at the equinoctial point. The devotee who is passively aware of the Supreme Self may benefit from this flowing grace. That moment is like the moment of passing color shades of the setting sun. Sandhyabralikeva Muhutaranga. In yogic parlance, that moment of grace is also termed Vishuvat and Abhijit, while different from Uttaramarga, higher path, and Dakshinamarga, lower path, as referred to in the Bhagavad Gita, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Panchastavi, etc. For an external illustration, the two moments geographically correspond with summer equinox and winter equinox. But in the internal setting of the moment there is no taint of any thought whatsoever, as is beautifully put by Sri Shamba. Tadyamanya Vishuvadabijin Madhyama Katyasunya. It is called Madhya Marga, the middle path or royal path. This middle path of graceful character is Kirtya Shunya, without any taint of action, for there is no egress or ingress of prana and apana for the period one can remain in the state. It is the state of perfect ease, termed samadhi, the state of bliss, nay, in which the soul experiences the eternal and supersensuous joy which can be apprehended only through the subtle and purified intellect, and wherein established the said yogi moves not from truth on any account. Bhagavad Gita 6:21. It is then that Shaktipada may come to happen out of sovereign spontaneity. How Shaktipada works. Shaktipada affords what is called the waking samadhi to the devotee yogin, to whom effortless normal state of consciousness is revealed. Utpaladeva uses the phrase Vyuthanepi Samahita, wherein, in his own words, there is spontaneous revelation of supreme reality. Evameva Shiva Basasyat. Ashtavakra uses almost the same phrase to effect his grace upon Janaka, that is, Evema Shukibhava. By this it becomes clear that Shaktipada is bestowed, not obtained. Lord Shiva, in the form of Guru, gives the aspirant ammunition to fight the attraction towards petty enjoyments of the world. Otherwise, the search remains a mere intellectual exercise, and the individual soul becomes an easy prey to confusion, doubt, and frustration. Since the source of grace is the real self, all beings can partake of it equally, but the veil of ego, even though unreal, blocks the light of grace, as do the clouds which cover the sun, and make its life-giving power ineffective. One has therefore to wait and watch with passive spontaneity, as is said, waiting for the word of the Master, watching his hissing sound. One has only to be alert with purity of mind and sincerity of heart till Shaktipada is bestowed. Then how it works is remarkably expressed in the Satdarshana Bhasya of Sri Ramana Maharshi. The beyond takes hold of you. You can feel yourself one with the one that exists. The whole body becomes a mere power, a force current. Your life becomes a needle drawn to a huge massive magnet, and as you go deeper you become a mere center, and not even that, for you become mere consciousness. There are no thoughts and cares any longer. They are shattered at the threshold. It is an inundation. You are a mere straw. You are swallowed alive. But it is very delightful for you to become the very thing that swallows you. This is the union of Jiva with Brahman, the loss of ego in the real self, the destruction of ignorance, the attainment of truth. Shaktipada worked on Shukadeva when King Janaka told him, "Even if the whole of Mithila burns, nothing is burnt to me." Shaktipada worked in Maitreyi when she posed a resounding question to sage Yajnavalkya, her husband, while he was renouncing that which cannot give me immortality. Of what avail is that property to me? It worked in Namadeva when he ran after the dog who had taken away his bread. The saint ran after the dog, saying, "Oh, my Gopala, just stop and let me apply butter to the bread, so that you swallow it with ease." This is how Shaktipada works. In the end, I again quote Ramana Maharshi, who gave a practically useful prescription for aspirants to follow. Retreat ever within thine own self. Seek the source whence the restless mind spins out an unceasing web of thoughts. Brush aside the springing thought. Concentrate at the root of thought, and take response in that stillness and quietude. So much is thy effort. What next is one for inner realization and does not admit to exposition in words. The 9 variations of Shaktipada. Actually, there are no classes of grace. These are, as Abhinavagupta himself says, only the variations between intensity and slow process. The 9 degrees of Shaktipada discussed in the Tantraloka and Tantrashara are in brief. 1. Tivra, or the grace of extreme intensity. This is spontaneous and sudden, infused with the great power, Mahashakti Samabhishta. Jayaratha, in his commentary of Tantraloka, says that the person who happens to receive this degree of Shaktipada is fit for experiencing the wonderful reality of supreme consciousness. It is impressed that such a soul cannot live in a body, and that he is automatically liberated at once. 2. Madhyativra, or the grace of middle intensity. With this degree of grace, ignorance gets dissolved because the yogin himself knows the essence of liberation and bondage through his own wisdom and not from the external guru or shastra. His body remains, but ignorance vanishes. He has unflinching devotion to Rudra Shiva, Rudra Bhakti Suniskala. This sign of the yogi, according to the Purva Shastra, is followed by mantra siddhi, accomplishment of the divine syllable. The third sign is control over all the elements, Shravatatva, Vasitvam. The fourth sign is indifference towards the fruit of actions of previous birth, Prarabdhakarya Nispati, and the fifth sign is perfection in knowledge and speech, Kavitvam, Sharvashastra Thavaturtvam. 3. Mandativra, or the grace of slow intensity. The yogin gets eager to meet his preceptor, who is perfect in every respect. Samsida Samskrito Pita. He becomes instantly liberated at the time when his preceptor initiates him into the Absolute and continues to live in the body as Jivanmukta. All doubt regarding pain and pleasure of the body goes off. 4. Tivramadhya, or the grace of intense middle degree. When initiation does not become firm in the aspirant because of certain persisting impressions, these haunt the mind throughout his life, and so there is absence of comprehension of the Absolute. He knowingly asserts that he is Shiva, but gets release only after leaving the mortal coil. He is called Putraka Sadhaka. 5. Madhya, or the grace of middle degree of middle intensity. The yogin, even being earnest to profit by attaining Shivahood, Shivalabhotsako Pishan, enjoys yogic accomplishments in the same body and finally, on its fall, attains to Shiva. Such an aspirant is known as Shivadharmi. 6. Mandamadhya, or the grace of slowed middle intensity. This aspirant, in the category of Shivadharmi, enjoys yogic accomplishments in the following birth. After that, he attains to Shiva through the slow degree of Shaktipada. 7. Tivramanda, or the grace of slow but intense degree. The aspirant sustains with the power of initiation. He enjoys his desired accomplishments through some lives. In the long run, he takes to the path of Sakala or Akala, concrete or absolute, according to his capacity, and finally attains Shivahood. Such an aspirant is called Lokadharmi. 8. Madhyamanda, or the grace of slow but middle degree. The aspirant of this category enjoys his accomplishments through some more births and life experiences, and finally gets initiation in the course of attainment of Shivahood. 9. Manda, or the grace of slow, very slow degree. The aspirant, by and by, passes through Shalakya, seeing from near, Shamipya, being near, and Shayujya, becoming one with, stages of spiritual development, and only after enjoying the accomplished desires, receives initiation for proceeding towards the attainment of Shivahood. There is essential relation between Shaktipada and Kundalini. Awakening of Kundalini Shakti takes place with corresponding variations of Shaktipada. In fact, it is the power of grace that brings about various blossoms on the tree of Kundalini. It is the sovereign will of Lord Shiva that works through Shakti Parvati, unconditioned by any human effort. It falls spontaneously on any seeker after truth in its own range of variety, comprising intense, tivra, middle, madhya, and slow, manda degrees. This trichotomy of Shaktipada apparently works through Kundalini Shakti in various ways of its various states. It is therefore that this essential power is given the name Mahakundalini. The 9 degrees of Shaktipada are described to set a standard for aspirants who have to comprehend the intricacies and subtleties within the limitations of their minds. According to different modes of the awakening of Kundalini, the 9 kinds of Shaktipada are classified under 3 heads. 1. Tivra, comprising Tivra Tivra, Madhya Tivra, and Manda Tivra, falls in the region of Bodha Kundalini, which awakens through the grace of sudden and spontaneous revelation of supreme knowledge. 2. Madhya, comprising Tivra Madhya, Madhya Madhya, and Manda Madhya, is the range of Chit Kundalini, or grace through Chitta, i.e., reflection, meditation, etc. 3. Manda, comprising Tivra Manda, Madhya Manda, and Manda Manda. It is the work of Prana Kundalini, the grace initiating the right practice of prana and apana, or simply called pranayama, including japa and other modes of saguna worships. Awakening of Kundalini thus takes place in the corresponding degrees of Shaktipada. Peace be to all, on this earth, in the sky, and beyond. Hadowich of Antwerp and Hadowich II. Mysticism of Being in the 13th Century in Belgium. Odette Baumer d'Espagne. We will possess 3 14th century manuscripts of Hadowich of Antwerp's writings, which contain 31 letters, 45 poems in stanzas, 16 poems in couplets, and 14 visions, followed by a so-called list of perfects. Of the 3 manuscripts, only one does not contain 13 additional poems and couplets, poems 17 through 29, while Hadowich of Antwerp's writings are thought to have been produced between 1220 and 1240. Recent research attributes poems 17 through 29 to another Beguine who wrote about a decade later. The Carthusian Dom J.B. Porion dates these additional poems at 1250, names the author Hadowich II, and her lyrics New Poems. Most certainly, says Porion, Hadowich II belongs to the same circle of Beguines and is spiritually so near that she is called by the same name. The present essay is based on Hadowich of Antwerp's letters and poems. All quotations follow Mother Columba Hart's translation, Hadowich, The Complete Works, London, SPCK, 1981. The visions are intentionally left out, as we want to focus on her doctrinal work, letters and poems, written, so to say, from a waking state of consciousness, visionary literature being a theme in itself. For Hadowich II, we follow the only existing translation into a modern language, that by J.B. Porion, Hadowich d'Anvers, Écrits mystiques de Beguine, with additional references to the critical edition in Middle Dutch. From a historical point of view, we do not know anything about Hadowich of Antwerp, except the fact that her name designates her birthplace. Fortunately, we have an important testimony of Hadowich's historical existence in the words of John of Leeuwen, the cook and disciple of the Dutch mystical writer John Rusbroek, who wrote a century after her death. We know of a saint and glorious woman called Hadowich, who was an authentic spiritual guide. The doctrine she expresses in her books is correct and inspired by God, but not useful for everyone, for many whose inner eye has not yet been opened by pure and silent love are not able to understand. This testimony proves that Hadowich was known and considered by Ruysbroek himself to be an authority in spiritual matters. In fact, he integrated many of her thoughts in his own theological works. Mother Hart says in her introduction to Hadowich's complete works, Ruysbroek took over the various elements of her mystical thought, deepened and enlarged them through his knowledge of theology and metaphysical psychology, and built from them his spiritual synthesis. It is important to add that Ruysbroek indifferently quotes both Hadowich of Antwerp and Hadowich II. Hadowich of Antwerp's importance is only fully understood in terms of her formation and life as a Beguine, and in terms of events which occurred in the Low Countries during the 13th century, which influenced the emergence of new types of religious vocations, including the organization of 6 crusades, the advent of the bourgeois, the expansion of the cities and trade, and the foundation of the first universities. During Hadjiwicz's life, dissolute behavior and corruption of the clergy were widespread. Monastic life was not everywhere in a much better condition. In many monasteries, the primitive rule was no longer observed. In reaction to this situation, a great fervor animated many layers of society zealously at work in religious renewal. In response to an intensified clericalization of the Church, a new mentality arose among laymen and women who began to recognize the gospel as their sole rule of conduct. Spiritual life thus became an individual concern. The view of Joachim of Flora, 1202, in particular, his foreseeing of a renewal in the Holy Spirit with the coming of time, were widely spread and often repeated. Within this context, the Beguinal movement represents a spontaneous upheaval at the turn of the 12th century amongst spiritually minded laywomen who wanted to lead a simple life dictated by the gospel. They voluntarily practiced chastity and poverty without joining any existing religious order. The Beguines had neither a founder nor a foundress and were not an offshoot of monasticism. They wanted to remain independent and free from religious formalism. The first group of Beguines emerged in the Duchy of Brabant. The oldest of those mulieres religieuses, pious women, was Mary of Oigon, 1177 to 1213. In her biography, Magister Jacques de Vitry writes that Mary was a literate woman married to a rich merchant in Nivelles. Following their religious longings, both decided to retire to a nearby leprosarium and take care of the sick. They stayed there 12 years. During that time, Mary acquired such a great reputation for sanctity that she was overwhelmed with visitors, clerics, and lay people. Feeling the need to lead a more solitary life, she went with her husband's agreement to Oigon and settled down as a lay sister in a little house next to the priory of the Augustinian canons. In spite of her desire to remain unknown, she became the spiritual mother of the priory, and again a multitude of visitors from far and near came to receive her advice. One visitor from Paris was her future biographer, Jacques de Vitry. With Mary's encouragement, he joined the Augustinians and became a popular wandering preacher. His sermons were so much the reflected image of Mary's zeal for the cure of souls that he would say of himself, "I was merely her instrument." He ends his biography of her, saying that on her deathbed she praised the Trinity in oneness, and oneness in the Trinity at length. As early as 1208, it is recorded that, inspired by Mary, 7 women were living together in Nivelles and consecrating their lives to prayer and charitable works. They were spiritually guided by Master John of Nivelles, in close connection with the Cistercian Abbey of Villers. This intense and fervent religious movement spread like wildfire, and groups of Beguines were formed in all cities of the Low Countries as well as in France and Germany. Neither simple laywomen nor nuns, the Beguines formed pious associations, whose numbers went into the hundreds and even thousands. Everywhere they had the same aim, to fight silently against the sclerosis of the hierarchical church and against the corruption of society, leading a contemplative life right in the middle of the cities. To become a Beguine meant to adopt a new style of religious life, a life of chastity and poverty without following any canonical rule or taking any vows. This new style of spirituality rendered the Beguines less dependent on the tutelage of the clergy. Life as a Beguine was open to women of all classes in society, of all ages, and of all states. They were unmarried, married if the husband consented, and widowed. However, most of them belonged to the aristocratic or patrician families. Among them many were learned persons and highly gifted mystics. Lamprecht von Regensburg, a contemporary of Hadjiwicz, in his poem De Toctation, speaks of pious women living in Brabant before 1250, whose meditation rendered them free of themselves and everything, and led them to see God without intermediary, God as He is. In the early years of the movement, the Beguines remained in their own houses, devoting their time to prayer and works of charity. As their number increased, they joined small groups living in the house of one of their rich members. In their turn, small groups joined forces and built small houses next to each other in courtyard form, with a church in the center. From then on, one can speak of a real Beguinage. Each one was led by a great mistress, elected by the Beguines. The regulations were flexible enough to adapt to every type of spirituality, including ecstatic prayer, love mysticism, or minimistic, and speculative mysticism, or Wessenmystik. Each house's rules differed according to local conditions. The main concern of the community was to participate daily in the liturgy, to recite the hours together, to listen to spiritual instruction, and to devote much time to private contemplation. Most Beguines' time was spent in silence in their own houses, so that they never ceased to pray. Once a week they met in council and listened to the sermon of the great mistress. New candidates were required to undergo a period of probation during which they were individually instructed by an older member. As regards the financial organization, the rich members provided for those who were less well off. Donations were received, and all of them were obliged to earn their livelihood by suitable work, such as teaching or making lace, spinning, making embroidery. Beguines were also engaged in works of charity, maintaining hospitals, and nursing the sick people outside the Beguinage. Parish priests, Cistercians, and later Franciscans or Dominicans took pastoral responsibility for them and provided them with religious writings in the vernacular, biblical translations, and excerpts from classics of spirituality. But in 1242, the general chapter of the Dominicans, afraid to see women well versed in theological knowledge, forbade the dissemination of these translations. In spite of this interdiction, they remained extremely literate, for in some Beguinages they were able to maintain their own school of liberal arts. As early as in 1216, Jacques de Vitry, now returned to his clerical state, obtained official recognition by the papal curia of the Beguines' new association, thus permitting them to live in common and to perfect themselves in virtue by mutual assistance. This recognition ensured their autonomy for the new lifestyle they had adopted, whose very essence was its voluntary, temporary, and informal character. It also permitted the more gifted among them to teach and guide their sisters. Later, when the Brabant Beguines were suspected of heterodoxy by a hierarchy sensitive to possible anti-clericalism, it is the same Jacques de Vitry who took up their defense. In the course of time, the ecclesiastical hierarchy attempted to institutionalize them. Some groups did voluntarily submit to canonical constitutions and became monasteries. In 1311, Rome condemned the movement, declaring it should be abolished forever from the Church. Nevertheless, in Brabant, many Beguines did not submit and resisted the ecclesiastical ban. They were officially rehabilitated 8 years later. A portrait of Hadewich from her writings. The only source of information concerning Hadewich of Antwerp's personality is her writings, especially her letters, mostly addressed to young Beguines. In her we find the origin and the basis of Flemish mysticism, as well as the first author to write on spiritual matters in the vernacular. From the way she writes, we can infer that she belonged to a patrician or even a noble family, for her works betray a refined education and the possession of a vast field of learning. According to the tradition in the upper classes of society of her time, she must have visited a school of liberal arts and acquired extended theological knowledge from another source. She was proficient in Latin, for she often quotes scripture. It is also evident that her theology is based on a deep acquaintance with the spiritual classics of masters such as St. Augustine, St. Bernard, and William St. Thierry. Her use of French expressions reveals her knowledge of that language. Moreover, she was a lyric genius as well as a perfect prose writer. Her works stand among the masterpieces of Flemish literature. In the field of poetry, she was well informed of the poetry of the Trouvère. Her poems are written in the language of courtly love in Mine. She feels free to use the term Mine to express her love relationship with God, and at the same time transforms its meaning genially to a high spiritual level. The austere service of love offered to the lady by the Trouvère becomes the service of love offered by the soul to God. If Hadjewicz's writings reveal a very intensive, affective life, she never becomes sentimental or childish in the way she expresses her love for God, even if she does it in passionate terms. My soul melts away in the madness of love, Orowit. In all circumstances, she remains a well-balanced person, full of common sense and humor. She writes to a young Beguine, "Always do remain humble in every way, yet not so humble that you become foolish." To another disciple she says, "First, be subject to your reason, and remain without singularities. Don't make a show of your spirituality." Hadjewich is a noble and fierce soul who throughout her life and without fault pursues her way unwaveringly, her whole being concentrated on her ideal. She plays the role of spiritual mother with self-conscious authority, convinced that she fulfills God's will and that she will be given the capacity for doing it. Hadjewich is not a theoretician in mysticism. Her own experiences are the source of her writings. She has only to draw out of the plenitude of her interior maturity. Undoubtedly, she belongs to the mysticism of love, the minimistic, but she would like to demonstrate that she belongs simultaneously to the deepest current of speculative mysticism, a mysticism of being not only underlies all her pursuit of love, but is the dominant element in her inmost quest. In her own words, "Love allures the soul and heart and makes the soul ascend out of itself and out of love and into the essence of love." According to Hadjewich of Antwerp and Hadjewich II, divine love is paradoxical, for it implies at once a relationship with and an absorption in the inaccessible one. Hadjewich's pilgrimage to God. Hadjewich began her adventurous pilgrimage very early. "Since I was 10 years old, I have been overwhelmed by such intensive love that I should have died if God had not given me other forms of strength than people ordinarily receive, and if he had not renewed my nature with his own being." Throughout her life, Hadjewich's main concern was to show the way to the depths. Her spirituality is experience-centered and emerges from her own personal contact with the mystery that lies at the heart of every human being. Her theological reflection is based on Augustinian exemplarism. We have to return from whence we come, to what we have not ceased to be in the Logos. As she so uniquely says, we have not yet become what we are. Self-knowledge in its deepest sense is the aim for which Hadjewich strives. In letter 18 we read, "Understand the deepest essence of your soul, what soul is. Soul is a being that can be held by God, and by which again God can be beheld." It is on such metaphysical principles that her whole spirituality is grounded, while the motive power which propels her on the way, we could even say her technique, is ardent love of God, a love which is more than affective love, even more than a stormy, fiery longing, aurawet. It is a one-pointed, intense inner tension towards the yet unknown, the absolute, a readiness for total surrender of one's entire self to God. In her own words, "Give yourself to God to become what He is." Such is the real originality of Hadjewich's way that she proceeds simultaneously along the path of love and the path of knowledge, whose end is vacuity in the undifferentiated Godhead beyond, or at the core of the three persons of the Trinity. In a divine clarity the soul sees, and it sees nothing. It sees a truth, subsistent, effusive, total, which is God himself in eternity, the being of the Godhead in the unity. These are certainly daring sayings. Porion, commenting on this letter, suggests to readers that they be seen as analogous. We would like to suggest that they somehow be taken more literally for what they are, an attempt at crystallizing the ineffable mystical experience which no human utterance can express. The soul that has stood so long with the God-man that it understands such a wonder as God is in his Godhead, appears most of the time for those who are not acquainted with this experience to be ungodly through too much godliness, ignorant through too much knowledge. Letter 28. Hadjewich's spiritual itinerary unfolds in three stages: the virtuous service of the beloved Lord, the new path which she denominates, love's new school, and a dimension of the consciousness which she calls nothingness in love, the noble service of the beloved Lord in all works of virtues. Speaking with all her authority, she says, in letter 30, "He who wishes to be one with the Godhead must adorn himself with all virtues with which God clothed and adorned himself when he lived as a man." Not only does she insist on practice, but she exhorts the novice. Acquire a knowledge of all the virtues and learn them by exertion, by questioning study and earnest purpose. Letter 24. It is most remarkable how Hadjowich, in Letter 17, also preaches the practice of virtues in paradoxical terms akin to those of Zen koans, translating them afterwards in terms of exemplarist theology. Be generous and zealous for every virtue, but do not apply yourself to any virtue. This she explains. The things I order you belong perfectly to the perfection of love, and belong perfectly and wholly in the divinity. For to be generous and zealous is the nature of the Holy Spirit, and not to apply oneself to a particular work is the nature of the Father. This pouring out and keeping back is the pure divinity, and the entire nature of love. Fail not with regard to a multitude of things, but perform no particular work. The first of these verses expresses the power of the Father. The second verse expresses his just will, with which his justice works its unknown mighty works. These works are deep and dark, hidden for all who are below this unity of the Godhead, but nevertheless render service to each of the three persons. And a few paragraphs further she adds, have good will and compassion for every need, but take nothing under your protection, and explains. The first verse expresses what is proper to the Son, the second expresses the nature of the Father, who engulfs him, the Son, in himself. This terrible great work ever belongs to the Father, yet it is the unity of purest love in the divinity. This saying may be regarded as a commentary on 1 Corinthians 15:28. When everything is subjected to him, the Son himself will be subject in his turn to the one who subjected all things to him, so that God may be all in all, meaning that souls are engulfed in the Son and together with him in the Father. The letter ends with these words, how you are to do or omit each of these things may God our beloved teach you. The new path, or love's new school, following the example of the Travers, she sings of a spiritual renewal through love, under the vestment of the rebirth of nature in spring. When March begins, we see all being live again, and all plants spring up, and in a short time turn green. It is the same with longing, particularly that of the true lover of God. They who come to love's new school, with new love, love shall cause them to ascend to love's highest mystery. But before one attains this high mystery, which is to partake of and have fruition of love's nature, Hadjowich knows only too well that one has to risk many adventures, for the way which leads to such an experience is paved with trials and requires a long and patient asceticism. Poem 10 says it clearly, lo, the day of love is dawning, when men will never fear pain for love's sake. She goes so far as to say, love has driven me to the verge of death, for the fire of love burns to death everything it ever touches. But the fierce Beguine does not ask for any remedy, and goes on questing the depthless depths of love, sure that love always repays even though it often comes late. Hadjowich insists on this point, saying that love requires a total abandonment of all self-centeredness, and is a remorseless process of dying to oneself. He who wants to remain faithful to love must enter still living into death. In another poem, she explains that spiritual life is a dynamic existence, for love is ever new. It causes the soul at all times to begin out of a new death. In letter 19, she states precisely where this dynamism leads. When the soul is engulfed in God and brought to naught, the soul becomes with him all that he himself is. She thus summarizes the program of love's new school. If you wish to follow your being in which God created you, you should valiantly lay hold on the best part, I mean the great totality of God, as your own good. Letter 6. These different quotations show how Hadjowich's love experience extends beyond affectivity, beyond emotiveness, how she discovered and realized on an experiential level the metaphysical basis of love mysticism, and how it flows forth into a mysticism of being. In the light of love we can learn how we shall love the God-man, in his godhead and in his manhood. Thus, to live Christ as God and man is the most fascinating formulation. It means much more than to follow Christ or live with Christ. It is pregnant with a deep essential experience, which is to live in total accordance with him, as he lived in consequence of his being God incarnate. It is experiencing Jesus as the supreme and unique paradigm of the God-man relationship, as well as the man-God relationship. In letter 6, written to a dearly beloved, she explains, "With the humanity of God you must live here on earth, in the labors and sorrows of exile, while within your soul you love and rejoice with the omnipotent and eternal divinity in sweet abandonment. For the truth of both the humanity and the divinity is one single fruition." This last assertion springs out of Hadjewicz's own experience. It echoes a spiritual attainment in which the two poles of inner life, the affective and the metaphysical, are at the deepest level symbiotically joined. Hadjewicz has reached the point where dialectical oppositions become creative polarities, as George Valin said. To attain such a state, Hadjewicz suggests a special technique which is worth noticing. Letter 6. Love the divinity not merely with devotion, but with unspeakable desires, Orowet, always standing before the terrible and marvelous countenance in which love reveals herself, and engulfed all works. It is worth noticing the subtle difference made here between devotion, a personal and active approach of God, and Orowet, the fury of love, which reduced the soul to inaction, to standing in a kind of non-action, in which dialogue ends in silence. Nothingness in love, paradoxically enough, in poem in couplet 16, called Love's Seven Names. The highest name Hadjewicz finds to give is Hell. Hell is the seventh name, for there is nothing love does not engulf and damn. As hell turns everything to ruin, in love nothing else is acquired, but disquiet and torture without pity. The soul is wholly devoured and engulfed in her unfathomable essence. After passing such an ordeal, Hadjewicz realizes that she has undergone a deep inner metamorphosis, and can only stammer, "What has happened to me now? I have given away all that I can. I am not mine. Love has engulfed the substance of my spirit." What else could be added to such a statement? Love made her penetrate into a new dimension of consciousness. It has driven her out of her peripheral ego into a state of vacuity. If she says the substance of her spirit has been ruined, what remains? Only the most essential, which she was looking for from the beginning. She laid hold on her own good, which is God, and nothing less. These daring sayings cannot be dismissed as being only verbal exaggerations. They have the flavor of lived experience, of authenticity. They are neither the fruits of beliefs or intellectual knowledge, nor of affective excesses, but of events intuitively experienced. Henceforth, only through paradoxical terms can she speak of her approach to the divine mystery. She confesses her inability to find adequate terms to speak of her experience in the depths of her being. No words exist to express these things, so far as I know. Letter 17. He who wishes to speak about these things must speak with his soul. Letter 28. And she describes her experience of inner barrenness. To be reduced to nothingness in love is the most desirable thing I know, fighting love with longing, wholly without heart and without mind. In such a state of barrenness, in which there is no more heart nor mind, how is it possible to express any longing? These verses prove that every attempt to express her experience has failed. Her only choice is to take refuge in the ineffable, there where laissez-faire and non-action is the only norm. The soul has to remain in a blissful silence. Letter 28. I must then live out what I am. Hadjewicz does not mean here any kind of vanishing of consciousness. On the contrary, she hints at an awakening which rises up out of the deep engulfment she has undergone. It is then that nothingness explodes into fullness, fullness of the experience of the omnipresence of the deity who is love. Letter 17. She makes a last attempt at speaking with her soul, in letter 28, in which we read, "The soul sees how God is in his eternity, God through his own divinity. In all this, it contemplates God in his Godhead, and in each of its attributes." This difficult epistle ends with a no less difficult paragraph in which she relates anew her own experience. Thus spoke a soul in the liberty of God. I have understood all diversity in the pure unity. I remained there standing above all things, and I looked out above all things into the glory without end. In a text which is regarded as being a sermon, but filed as letter 22, we read, "Those who follow this inner path penetrate within God from depth to depth. They walk outside all the ways open to the human mind." We will never be able to know exactly what Hadjewich meant by walking outside the way of representation. Could she have wanted to suggest through this ultimate metaphor the most inner secret of the One, which only the high fruition of love can penetrate? Or is this state the state of enstasis, as Mircea Eliade calls it, in which the ego explodes and the relational becomes changed over into the transpersonal? By way of explanation, one can consider the question she asked in letter 30, which again is reminiscent of 1 Corinthians 5:28. What happens to those who have fully grown up and answered the fearful demand of the unity of the Godhead, when they make their ascent without returning? There, where the brilliant lightning flashes and the loud thunder resounds, listen to the answer which follows. Then the soul is brought to union out of the multiplicity of gifts. It becomes all that is, the Godhead, united to the unity of the Godhead. This is an answer which is most paradoxical, for how can anything be united to the unicity? This is pure exemplarism. It describes the ineffable return of the soul to her original being in the Godhead. In less philosophical terms, Hadjewich exhorts her spiritual daughter, to whom she addresses in letter 18, to come to full inner growth in these simple and beautiful terms, making use of the inner power of sight of her soul. This power of sight has two eyes, love and reason. Reason advances toward what God is, by means of what God is not. Love sets aside what God is not and rejoices that it fails in what God is. This sentence shows clearly that for Hadjewich, love has the last word. Love is knowledge. Hadjewich II, her specific contribution. Unfortunately, only 13 poems from this unidentified Beguine have been preserved. They are contained in 3 of the 4 manuscripts. The 4th manuscript dates from the 16th century, of Hadjewich of Antwerp's works. They are filed as poems in couplets, Mengeldichten, 17 through 29. Both Hadjewich of Antwerp and Hadjewich II belong to the same milieu and spiritual lineage. Both are witnesses of mysticism of being in Middle Dutch before Ruysbroek. It should be reiterated that both had a considerable influence on later mystical theology. Ruysbroek quotes both Hadjewiches without making any difference between them. He simply appropriates many of their texts, developing their themes in a more systematic way. The so-called Hadjewich II style is more metaphysical. Her vocabulary is nearer to that of Rhineland mystics than that of Hadjewich of Antwerp, and is therefore dated a short span of time later, apparently nearer the time of Meister Eckhart. Like her elder sister, Hadjewich II is not a theoretician of mysticism, and her poems are the reflection of her own inner experience. They are lived theology. The first 2 of her 13 poems, poems in couplets 17 and 18, are a kind of digest of her spiritual itinerary. Right at the beginning, she warns those who want to follow her on her spiritual path that they will have to tread a solitary way, that is, to follow along a dark, unlaid, and unmarked path, an altogether inner path. This is a path on which what we apprehend in high contemplation through naked understanding is certainly great, and yet compared to what escapes our grasp, it becomes nothing. With more precision, she adds, forward into this non-perceived depth, in this nescience must our desire strive. The word desire is very pale compared to its Dutch equivalent, minne, which signifies a fiery will to dive into precisely that which escapes our faculties. That is this deficiency, ontbliven. Desire, then, needs qualification to suggest the strength of ardor, the fire of the high-mettled yearning which prompts her. The Middle Dutch word ontbliven, meaning deficiency, is in fact the central point of her thought and experience. She feels herself violently attracted by this beyond understanding. Pursuing inexorably her quest, she plunges into the unknown. Those whose desire penetrates deeper into the sublime, silent knowledge of pure love meet with an ever greater deficiency. Their understanding finds a modeless renewal in the unclouded darkness, in the presence of absence. To be able to perceive the divine presence without any mode, Sonderweise, means that she has grown aware of a new inner depth dimension in which God's personal absence is perceived as being his essential presence. Consistent with herself, our Beguine does not hesitate in front of the abyss of the unknown. On the contrary, she declares herself ready to risk her all. The soul must be uprooted from herself by love and hurled into the unfathomable abyss on high. There the soul abides in pure silence in her inmost recess. The soul must penetrate into the bareness of the one beyond reason, where return is impossible, where there is no light to help her, where neither higher knowledge nor deep intuition can cast anchor. There something noble, neither this nor that, guides the soul into and absorbs her in her origin. Poems in Couplets 18. Thus we see that the driving power which makes her fall into this abyss is love, mine. It is also love which has, from the very first step on the contemplative path, monopolized all her energies and sustained her all the way through the wild desert. In poem 17, Hadjiwich II has a few couplets which speak for themselves. Any commentary would take the bloom from their beauty. Understanding becomes isolated within the shoreless eternity, and with quiet desire devote itself to a complete immersion in boundless totality. There something quite simple yet undisclosable is revealed, the unalloyed pure void, einbletten. The strong hold fast in that naked void, rich in their intuition, yet faltering before the unknowable depths. To those inattainable depths they attribute a supreme value. In them they find their highest joy. I tell you, none can speak about it, save to say that he who desires inner understanding, and not just knowledge, must rid himself of reason's turmoil, of all forms and images. Those who do not divert themselves with other activities from those described here will find again unity in their first beginnings, in their principle. In the intimacy of the One, these souls are interiorly pure and naked, without forms or images, as though they were liberated from time, never created, freed from their outward limits in silent space. Here I stop. I find neither end nor beginning, nor any comparison which could justify the use of words. The only thing to add after the full stop of Hadjiwich is that for her, God is not objectifiable, and the void is not empty. In her other poems, Hadjiwich II tries to precise the inner transmutation she had to undergo in her depths. Once her soul had been established in this nakedness, in this passing away, overleden. It is love who teaches the soul in this inmost transformation into unity. Poems in Couplets 22. It is the unity of naked truth which adapts the soul to the onefold nature of eternity, of eternal essence. Poems in Couplets 29. Another topic sung again and again by Hadjiwich II is that of the immediacy of the divine presence in the soul in naked clarity and inner freedom, as it is, for example, in poem 23. In contemplation, the soul dwells with you, God, free and alone in unity. She loses all images, forms, and distinctions when you nourish her with your wisdom and grant her knowledge of your fullness, which she cannot understand, and which scholarly knowledge can never penetrate. This shows clearly that Hadjiwich II's experience lies beyond all distinctions, all opposites. It may be called a non-dual experience of God. She meets God without intermediary, Sondermittel. She has discovered the point of her rootedness in God, in the divine, in truth. The pure spark, life of the life of our soul, which remains without end, united to the divine source. Poems in Couplets 27. In poem 24, the same exemplarist intuition serves as canvas to express this subtle knowledge that the Holy Spirit reveals in the twinkling of an eye. Omnipotence attracts the soul, Logos instructs her, love leads her. Thus the three sweep her off into the unity, where the saints find blessings and fullness in their first principle, the pure deity. Gottheit. She then concludes with those daring verses. In the Godhead, no semblance of persons, the three in one are pure nakedness. Poems in Couplets 20. Finally, from the summit, our depths of her spiritual pilgrimage, our Beguine develops her thoughts about the life of the poor in spirit here on earth. In poem 26, she says, "It is not everything to withdraw from the world, to go begging one's bread and all. The poor in spirit must remain without thoughts in the vast simplicity of being, which has neither end nor beginning, nor form, nor mode, nor reason, nor senses, nor opinion, nor thought, nor purpose, nor science, unencompassed, unlimited. In this wild and solitary simplicity, the poor in spirit live in unity. There they find nothing but silence, ever responding to eternity's call." In reality, this silence, this void in which she has been absorbed, is not a void in the negative sense of the word. On the contrary, it is the undifferentiated plenitude of the divine essence. In her own words, unity and trinity are one and single omnipotence. We end this chapter with the last words of her last poem, Poems in Couplets 29. "Those who never understood the scriptures cannot use reason to explain what I have found in my inner being, without any intermediary, without a veil, beyond words." Her explicit reference to the scriptures shows that Hadjiwicz II considered herself as being in conformity with Catholic orthodoxy. In his introduction to her poems, Domporion underlines that, as far as he knows, no theologian ever did suspect of heresy the boldness of her style. An attempt at interpretation. There is scarcely any reason to comment on the significance of the astonishing statements of our Beguines. They do speak clearly for themselves. Their paradoxical terms, says Dom Porion, are transparent enigmas. Nevertheless, we think it is expedient to add a few remarks, for the domain of mysticism of being in the 13th century among women has been much too little studied so far. Chronologically speaking, the two Hadjiwiczes belong to the 13th century, but in reality they belong to a certain spiritual family which has no historical boundaries, which is transhistorical and transcultural. It seems necessary to emphasize the ease with which the Beguines, whenever they gathered, and in spite of those troubled times, were able to find a kindly ear among clergy and monks, who indeed even encouraged them, taking on the function of chaplains. This was especially so in Brabant, where they enjoyed right from the beginning close relations with the Cistercian monks at Villers, relations which were at once on individual and collective basis. Unfortunately, sermons given by the abbots or monks have not been preserved. It is only in hagiographical writings that we can get a glimpse of the different themes developed between monks and Beguines. It is known that some monks visited their spiritual daughters in the world, that others had a spiritual sister. Many a time we have evidence of monks seeking spiritual advices by the mulieres religieuses, recluses and Beguines. The interaction between Cistercian and Beguines was about equal. However vast and complex these spiritual currents were in Belgium, the center always remained the piety of the Beguines. Similarities with Bernardine piety are often less borrowings than points of contact in the emergence of the extra-regular. If the Hadjiwiczes based their writings on scripture and the authority of theological tradition, these writings contain no trace of reference to learning from a contemporary spiritual director. They contain only the reflection of the Beguine's personal experience. Moreover, neither Hadjiwiczes relates the experience of the highest states of consciousness to a life post-mortem. They insinuate that the highest states can be attained here on earth. The freedom they demonstrate in their choice of theological terms is partly due to the fact that at the time when they were writing, Thomas Aquinas had not yet finished his Summa. This implies that they had not to conform to dialectical rules of scholastics and could use freely a polyvalent vocabulary without having to make sharp distinction between the ontological and the intentional orders. The ultimate aim of each Hadjiwicz's pilgrimage is in no way different, nor do their starting points on their path or their ways of getting there differ. For both, the Minye thrust the soul into another metaphysical dimension, the abyss from on high, Hadjiwicz II, the bottomless abyss, Hadjiwicz of Antwerp. For both, it is precisely this leap into the unknown that affects the existential opening to transcendence, which reveals itself as being the other face of immanence. It seems evident that both Beguines reached an extraordinary level of interior life. In a way, they solved the squaring of the spiritual circle by an existential experience in the depths of their being, simultaneously through personal union with the beloved Lord and transpersonal identification in inner vacuity to the undifferentiated ultimate reality. In other words, they experienced the constitutive spiritual dimension of the human being, as Hadjewich of Antwerp wished, to understand the deepest essence of the soul. Soul is a way for the passage of God from his depths into his liberty, and God is a way for the passage of the soul into its liberty, that is, into his inmost depths, which cannot be touched except by the soul's abyss. Letter 18. Finally, it is important to recall that both, so to say, at the end of their itinerary, land in the pure deity, beyond the three persons, for it is precisely here that we see the essential continuity between the two Beguines. Hadjewich of Antwerp spoke of those who stay below the unity of the Godhead, and Hadjewich II said, "The three in one are pure nakedness." 700 years have passed, but the Hadgewiches have not lost anything of their actuality. One cannot but be fascinated by the personality of these women, who, with no trace of inferiority complex, fearlessly and with great serenity follow their bold path, heartened by both creative genius and an independent spirit which they wisely displayed in an ecclesiastical framework. Thanks to them, we rediscover today that dimension of deep interiority in the Christian tradition, which unfortunately has been either eclipsed or misunderstood for whole centuries.